Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends. We are beginning our session, Financial System in the Context of Macroeconomic Stability, New Opportunities and Old Restrictions. Indeed, over the last decade, discussions around economic growth and financial policies has intensified, especially in the context of quantitative easing policies pursued by some countries. It was quite successful in one country, but in other countries not so successful. While taking into consideration Decree 204 by the President of the Russian Federation about sustainable economic growth, discussions on financial policies is also intensified, and I think you probably noticed these discussions that are underway in our authorities, among our authorities, as one of the factors that is breaking this process is the financial policies and low budget expenditures. Also, the interest rates in the conditions of the state fiscal policies. The central bank has noted that the structural problems are the key factor rather than quantitative easing or low interest rates and money accessibility. So in any case, this discussion is still underway, and I think we will touch upon these issues somehow as well. So I think the key issue is the financial policy, fiscal environment, and the economic growth. So just to launch this discussion, I would like to invite Mikhail Mamuta, head of the Consumer Protection Rights Services and the Financial Services of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to begin this year with this discussion that is always takes place on such a high level. The Gaidar Forum has already become the kind of a venue that has a reputation as an expert discussion venue discussing various issues. And of course, I'm really delighted that so many people have attended this session, so we'll try to touch upon the issues that are of such interest to all those present. So let me speak about two particular issues. First of all, the theme of retail investments and what happens on the market on retail investment. I'll try to offer you the Bank of Russia view on the ways to attract investors, and we also would like to speak about the inclusiveness of the financial system and its accessibility. And then we'll probably, if there is a chance, we'll participate in the discussion. So there have been a few interesting sessions today. Well, maybe some of you have participated in the plenary session devoted to the independence of central banks. As one of the discussion streams there was related to the subject how relations of investors change in conditions of macroeconomic stability, retail investors' attitude towards different tools such as interest rates, financial services, fiscal products, and how they can ensure interconnection, linkage among each other. So I think what we see in Russia right now is a kind of a unique composition. It's a low inflation rate, stable low rate over the last years, which leads to macroeconomic stability, higher interests in institutional investors and their investments in the Russian economy. And in the meantime, we also see lowering interest rates and deposit interest rates, which has an impact on the behavior models, behavior patterns of different layers in the population. Some interest rates are now nearing 5%, well, depending on the bank, of course. But what we can see right now, that the majority of people believe that this interest rate is not high enough, comparing it with the deposit rates, which were 2-3 years ago on the market, 8-10% deposit rates. So they believe it's quite normal. But the paradox of the low inflation is the desire of people to have higher deposit rates, accompanied by low loan interest rates. Well, of course, it cannot be so, because lowering deposit rates causes dissatisfaction among many people, pushing them towards looking for new opportunities. How to actually, it's pushing them towards the market of short and long-term investments. On the one hand, it's good because the retail investors on the financial markets should play the role of a supplement to the institutional investors, and but it's not in counterposition to institutional investors. But we can see in American, Asian, and European markets, and we see that retail investors provide a sizable portion of the financial market, even in countries such as Portugal, which are not large in European scope. So the retail investors account for about 30% of the population. I mean, the people who have either shares, bonds, structural deposits, all types of financial instruments, and their combinations, of course. And we see that this process is now gaining momentum in Russia. Threefold growth of retail investors in Russia. So we should understand the reasons behind this. But we should also understand the reverse side, the flip side of this phenomenon, as we see more and more unqualified investors emerging on the market, the people who have not invested in the stock market before, the people who used to deal only with deposits, bank deposits. You cannot compare them with several thousand retail investors that have been active on the Russian market for many years and who have made their revenues. And in fact, even if they hadn't made much money, they've accumulated some expertise on the Russian market. So the pattern of behavior of these new investors are somewhat different from those who have already been long-time players on the market. So here, it's a good example of that we can help us to see how not to tighten the screws, so to say, but on the other hand, not to allow them to act so freely on the market because they might find themselves cheated, deceived on the market using the product which they do not quite understand. So if we have to follow this way, we will have to probably invent a bicycle, but the bicycle has been invented a long time ago. But what we have to do is just to take a look at how Europe was dealing with this. Probably Europe is closer to us in terms of mindset. 10 or 15 years ago, we watched quite a steady decrease in interest rates. And by the way, regarding the interest rates, we've already discussed with RANEPA. They said they asked us about interest rates of 5 to 6%. ESMA representatives were sort of sad about this. Even if someone could offer them a rate like that, they would run for that immediately, because the rates they have to act as like 0.25%. So of course there is some logic behind Western investors' emergence on the on the financial market. So we realize that the people who come to the market lack experience. So we looked into the European experience first of all, and a set of tools that is used in Europe to ensure this balance. Well, probably you know about the second FIT, its principles, and as the logic behind this is quite simple. So before you sell a complicated financial instrument to a certain person, the investor should be aware of the risks and specific features of this instrument. So it can be done with a classical testing, appropriateness or suitability tests, depending on whether you work with a broker or with a trustee or escrow manager. So it's a set of 3, 5, 8 questions, including an assessment, a self-assessment, how a person, what he thinks of himself, and whether a person understands what is a derivative and what is a forex or any other financial instrument. So what we're doing right now within the framework of this legislation on retail investors, you know that there is such a law that is now being prepared by the State Duma and our legislators. So we are trying to find the right balance between the right understanding and the protection of the unqualified investors. So we believe that we found an ideologically we found a balance between these two points. Well, technically there are some minor details that we have yet to sort out, but the sense behind is quite simple. If a person comes to the market with insufficient expertise and he wants to use a certain instrument, a certain financial tool, but whether it's complicated or non-complicated, it's a subjective thing. Who knows what derivative is and who understands what it is about? A derivative. So you understand what a derivative is. So that's a professional audience with a certain, with a shift in the knowledge base, so to say. So sometimes difficult to talk because you proceed from the premise that everyone is like a professional. But sometimes, you see that it's not always so. We understand that the classical economy, classical theoretical economy, where there are rational economic agents acting on both sides. There is and the seller is acting in good faith, and the buyer makes a conscious choice on a set of products. It's one thing, but it's a nice theory. But in practice, the behavior of large masses of people is subject to the behavioral economy pattern. Kahneman, Richard Marx, and other economists have described this at length. Well, of course, a person makes certain decisions irrationally under the impact of emotional signals, striving to earn as much as possible or to capture something which has not been captured by anybody else. But instead of catching this, he finds himself even poorer and miserable. Which means that, well, probably many of us have made such purchases in our lives, unconscious, irrational purchases. So before you acquire a certain instrument, you have to make sure that you understand it. That refers to all non-standard instruments. So not untypical instruments that you haven't seen before. So there is a second MiFID concept I mentioned before. You have to test certain products that have derivatives. Any product that has an internal structure, an inner structure. Part of the structure is difficult for understanding for some consumers, especially the associated risks. The so-called prepackaged or prepaid products, investment, retail products, a product that has a kind of an internal packaging. So if you look at the current market, we can see that unfortunately mis-selling, that is when a product is substituted by a retail deposit, proceeds on a wide scale. And it takes place precisely because a client does not fully understand what he deals with, and unfortunately some sellers make use of that. The classical is the SG deposits sales, which were bought by many people, but the classical story of the term deposits. So there are certain deposits, 6.5 interest, but on the condition that that you buy SSG and the trustee management scheme. So sometimes an idea is offered. There is a joke. There's someone knocks on the door. There's a tenant comes out and says, "Is it Mr. Ivanov? What happens? I'm going to live here. Did you buy a new program product yesterday? So the license agreement, terms and conditions, have you agreed to that?" And it says that I'm going to live with you. Who of you reads the license terms and conditions to the end? Sometimes they are written in a small font and it's difficult to understand them. That's why we are trying to promote the Gaidar model with information, some information and some documents, providing information to investors and retail investors, where briefly the risks are described. So I think the combination of these two models that are reflected in the draft bill on the protection of retail investor, that's the golden middle that will allow everyone to come to the stock market on the one hand and to understand what exactly they're buying. Well, I'm pretty sure that you shouldn't sell to a person what a product that he doesn't fully understand. So accessibility, inclusiveness is a fundamental category which correlates with the financial stability. And it correlates in the following way. There's been some special research which was done by IMF and FSP when in a certain country or in some countries there is a sizable portion of the population that do not have access to official financial services for different reasons. They begin to find a way to get these services in an unofficial manner. It's a kind of a shadow banking market that's we usually call it. So a large chunk of this shadow banking means that the regulator does not understand fully the risks accumulating on this market. So it may lead to a spillover or to some other aftermath that may impact the entire financial system. Therefore, our task as a mega regulator is to ensure the maximum level of inclusiveness in the financial system and financial accessibility for all interested parties and all citizens that want to make use of these products. So we have a special strategy of financial accessibility, of ensuring financial access, and I think that's where you can find all the definitions. A person must have a chance to buy a certain product or service at the time when he needs it, at precisely in the location where he is located, and at the price which meets his expectations. That's why we support the development of digital technologies, which has a positive impact on financial accessibility. And we also watch closely to prevent over-access. The problem of over-access when such services become accessible to such degree that it becomes harmful to a person. Ksenia Yudaeva mentioned this in the previous session, but the loan burden, the threshold loan burden, is a problem of a very subtle financial instrument that we start to use in Russia. So I believe in this discussion that we're holding today, the macroeconomic stability and new opportunities and old restrictions, I think these instruments precisely will give a chance to ensure balance in the conditions of changing environment.
But how successful it is and how efficient we will be, we'll understand only during the following discussion, and also how we'll be able to improve our instrumental kit as well as the instruments of financial organizations. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Thank you, Mikhail. I think that we'll listen to the presentations and make Q&A at the end. At the end of December, the Moskovsky Komsomolets interview, I said that one of the positive achievements of the 2019 was increase of private investors at the stock market, such as the bond market and the share market. it was objected by saying that new bubble is blowing because arrival of retail investors to the financial market seems as the no doubt is positive in tendency. And I don't think it's true to say that it will be a bubble. Otherwise, we go back to the age of one financial product, such as financial deposit in bank. I'd like to give the floor to Alexey Timofeyev, chairman of the Association of the Participation of the Stock Market Association. Thank you, dear colleagues, dear friends. Thank you for your presence here and congratulations. We have holidays now. Whether this last year was good or bad for financial market, maybe it was good, more good than bad. Let the 2020 be as good as the last year, the symbol of the good and success. Right away about the bubble. I'll say that I have a dual opinion. I'm related directly to the discussion that you mentioned. Bubble does not have to be on our market because the securities market is undervalued. In fact, instruments are undervalued and hardly on their own can be bubble on this market. On the other hand, it's true if we limit investments of the citizens, we'll make them limited to very narrow gauge of instruments. Hardly will have the short-term bubbles that didn't come in case we give them more opportunity for investing in diverse instruments. This is our argument with the central bank that we held probably all 2018 and 2019. I'll agree with what Mikhail said. We're close to agreement. We almost agree on one of the dramatic topics of discussion of 2019, categorization of investors. We agreed what approaches should be when we offer instruments to different groups of investors. In my presentation, I'd like to start with some numbers that are important, as I believe, from an institutional standpoint. Its presence of different groups of investors. 2019 was a year of active involvement of retail investors. It's fundamental change, which may have not happened, I agree with Mikhail, to a greater extent. Interested investors, or rather the citizens to the stock market, was due to decrease of the interest rate on deposits and habit of citizens to place their savings into deposits with two-digit yield. If not, we would use this habit, but this habit can lead to this great news. You shouldn't be afraid of it. One of the conditions of success of development of the stock market, in our view, will lead to the quality change, to the quality improvement, role of retail investors on any stock market that claims to be source of investment of the national economy. It's exclusively important. We have about 4 million citizens who trust their funds to the trust managers and brokers. I'm not saying about the owners of big estates. I'm talking about small investors. About 4 million people trusted their savings to the stock market. About 3 trillion rubles on brokers' accounts and in trusted management. We see further we go. We'll stop saying about this. Further we go, more than half of investors that open accounts, these are new investors. These are younger investors. These are investors other than those the market used to deal with. These investors more conservative, careful, knowledgeable. I agree with Mikhail's assessment, and the attitude towards them should be special. Shouldn't be afraid of this investor. This investor should be welcomed. We shouldn't be afraid that we shouldn't prevent them from making investment, and should give a choice on this market. The next industry I wanted to mention, industry of collective investments, the mutual investment funds, about 4 trillion rubles concentrated in this industry, but industry of retail open mutual funds holds about 500 billion rubles only, and this industry is unquestionably important from the standpoint of the toolkit that can be offered to the retail investors. Maybe the first step for the normal market for investments of retail investors, unfortunately, is not like this. We see a revival of industry at the end of last year. We'll see substantial growth of the volumes in 2020, and this is very good news and very good hope. Industry of the non-state pension funds, also about 4 trillion 200 billion resources concentrated in non-state pension funds. About 2.8 trillion is the savings. This industry stopped its development for known reasons, and this, in my view, one of the dramatic problems of development of Russian stock market. It describes 3 industries that play equal roles in the near future. Retail investors would rather play more role than 2 other industries on the stock market. This is not too good. We have to have more activity of institutional investors on this market, because, as properly Mikhail noticed, they oftentimes follow different behavioral patterns. Activity of the institutional investors supports activity of retail investors. We need very much long-term strategies that oftentimes are not characteristic of the retail investors, but characteristic of the institutional investors. We need to well formulate corporate governance that can be formulated by the institutional investors. We're afraid that when retail investors in the near future role on the stock market will grow, they will not be able to rely on the positive role that can be played by institutional investors. That's why we made fantastic work of attraction of retail investors. I'm not afraid to say that attraction of retail investors to the stock market was one of the most important reforms of financial market. Maybe in the world it will be noted in the same manner. I think the tendency of attraction of retail investors to this stock market in 2020, there's no reasons to believe otherwise. And yes, it requires regulation responses. We, together with the central bank, are working on this bill of the categorization. It will be adopted at the end of this year, and will describe what is the protection of the conservative unqualified. I don't believe in qualification and in turn increase of the financial literacy of the population. I believe in the industry that is able to cooperate with the unqualified investors. I believe we'll agree with the central bank about the protection for the unqualified investors on the stock market. Mikhail asked details. We have maybe one serious question in relation to the securities of the third line, both Russian and foreign. In this sense, I believe we shouldn't limit citizens regarding the first and the second list of the securities, I believe that formed on the Russian market, organized market of the foreign securities is one of the gems in the crown of Russian structure. The localization and circulation of foreign instruments on the market, on country market, was done by many countries, and thus they created financial centers, and we almost resolved this problem. We believe that people should have opportunity to select from broad spectrum of instruments and should not be subject to stricter rules than the investors around the globe are used to, in order to push the Russian investors into the embrace of the foreign investors, so that it doesn't give beneficiary any efforts that are made in terms of attraction of investors to become member of the foreign infrastructure. Keeping the competition, another question I'd like to dedicate some time to. Protection of interest of investors. Some words were spoken. The role of institutional investors should be increased. This is the next focal point of reform of the financial market. And the third is competition. We should keep a still competitive non-banking financial market. To a greater extent, attraction of retail investors. We are thankful to appearance of the largest banks. However, those banks interested in the financial market leads to the concentration of the services and products on this market. So the categorization question and the product competition are underappreciated. So have to be careful with the central bank, because it could violate the product competition. The banking chains is the key question, and the methods of resolution of this problem we see is creation of the so-called marketplace. It is proposed to name it like this by central bank. We believe that the statute is quite bulky and heavy to keep competition. We believe that yes, we need open architecture, and electronic platforms can perform the role of alternative to the banking networks. For this purpose, we need to form regulatory framework that will allow easily create electronic platforms for domestic and foreign financial instruments. We need to have open API. We need simplified identification and cross-identification on the financial market, so that we can allow non-banking institutions to compete as much as they can, using the advantages with the chains in offering financial products. I believe that the competition will allow us to solve many problems that we discussed, such as protection of the interests of investors. We should not do a lot to protect interests of investors if on the financial market we keep or develop strong competition, both product and service, between all kinds of groups of financial organizations for all kinds of groups of investors. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to make a commentary. I think that spring session, this statute will be adopted. Aksakov Anatoly is fully pro. As for the third line papers, what is paper that is not in the list, on the list? It's small issue, or low liquidity, or shortage of quality, or the combination of these parameters. We agree that if the security is not on the list but has enough rating, or the issue has a rating, the quality is comparative to the papers, to the securities on the list. They all have rating, but rating is good option. For the foreign securities, I think agreement is quite good. We can buy them, can sell them. Testing is needed, so a person should understand few things. the security is not issued in Russian jurisdiction, we will say it's ridiculous. It's clear, it's not funny, and it's not so obvious. When we asked people at focus group to read insurance contract for a motor vehicle, people broke on one hand, and on the other hand, what does it mean? I from one side and insurance company from the other side. Which is the other side? It's quite ridiculous. That the paper, the security is not Russian. Russian courts and Russian regulators will not be able to protect in case of the problems. And the third tax story. In order not to go too far, concrete example, we had complaint before New Year. A man is asking, he bought Facebook's stocks. He's from Russian broker. Why he had 30% retaining? Because broker is not tax agent, doesn't have power, so they retain 30%. He's disappointed. He wanted to have more revenue, more yield. That's why talking about testing, they have to understand. The idea is that the testing is checking the understanding. It's not a barrier. I think here we're absolutely in the same paradigm. Don't say any problem. As for the marketplace, in my view, is the future. Once a year we conduct research of the channels of usage of different financial services. During latest testing, more than half Russians use distribution channels as the key channels. Not many go to offices to buy something. These are older people, let's say, certain categories. Internet is not so widespread. Majority people use internet. People who say that they're ready to make financial market acquisition through internet is growing. About 40% out of remaining part of population that doesn't use these channels as the key channels express readiness and interest in doing so. That's why marketplace is the competitive platform on internet where people can select best proposal, and the system will be selecting for them variety of these offers. Should have equal access. This will give priority and advantage for the small players for whom difficult to go to big audience, but we should be sure that information is disclosed in full, clear to a man, there is no abuse, and that a man makes the best choice. For this purpose, we support this bill and we work together on adoption.
Thank you. The title of the session, Macroeconomic Stability, when we were writing this, there were certain contradictions. Since the economic wing is now split into two parties, the party of stability and the party of economic growth. And it's quite often the stability is impacted by economic growth, and it is pursued at the expense of economic growth. I would like to give the floor to Yana Boreskina, the representative from Finance Ministry, Director of the Department of the Financial Policies in the Ministry of Finance. Please, your opinion. Thank you, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. So what we can say, that's probably financial inclusiveness is can be referred to as financial stability to a certain extent, because since the people have an access towards certain instruments which are vital for their lives, that supports the financial system. So as regards the inclusion, let me comment on Mikhail Mamut's idea that we can provide access to the people to the white sector without creating any gray sectors where people will try to enter looking for trying to satisfy their needs. So the question is about the access towards certain instruments. When we provide protection for investors, we talk first of all about the complexity of structural products such as derivatives, forex, and so on and so forth. However, we are not talking about the fact that we do not have corporate bonds today on a large scale for general access, for public access. So no shares accessible to everyone as a mass phenomenon. So maybe there is some sense in looking at that and also talking about corporate governance. There is good sense to think about this as well. So we were talking about minority shareholders, but on the other hand, we envy our colleagues in Europe and America that have been giving the shares or inheriting the shares between generations, such as Ford shares, for example. So probably to diversify the instruments for large-scale investors, it would make sense to think about this. I quite agree with Alexey Timofeyev that the investors at large, their access should rely on confidence in the industry. I like very much the trend which is now gaining momentum on the market, that it is now going from the banking groups towards professional market players. So what I see right now is a kind of dissolution of professional players' borders. Digital transformation of certain venues, but these venues are mostly for standard type products. But when we talk about implementing the know your client principle, that we have to explain certain salient features of certain instruments, that we need to involve mass investors into this market. So I do hope that on the current economic situation, support will be provided for masses of investors that will help us to maintain the serious growth of retail investors that is now taking place thanks to this situation. What we can see from the addresses of retail investors towards regulators, first of all, it means mis-selling rather than misunderstanding of the product. The cross-sales, especially in regions, the operators, who are these people? Can they explain the need and the certain specific features of a certain instrument? The policies, the investment policies of life insurance in every case. Well, this is probably wrong. We see high risk of fraud as well. It's quite recently we've approved some legislative initiatives when using the licenses of professional players, some gambling was initiated. So that's what we have to fight against, and I think that's what the state should do using the regulatory bodies. Talking about retail investors, I think that it would be nice to think at least on the level of some agreements and conceptual understanding what kind of categories and what rights and obligations can be provided in connection with that. So by analogy with small businesses, we allow them to participate in competitions, in different bidding processes. So proceeding from these principles, we can also use the same treatment towards retail investors. So national projects, a large amount of money are now invested in the construction of infrastructural facilities such as roads, bridges, and so on and so forth. So we can probably allocate a certain portion of that for masses of investors, so as to launch, to trigger this phase of confidence among masses of investors. So I think the theme of investment will probably be linked by these people to the state investments, in the solution of certain nationwide goals. So in this context, I think the infrastructure of the financial market is also of prime importance. All of us can see that today is quite expensive, and therefore there are some ideas about alternative sites, crowdfunding, simplified procedures. So I think we should probably think about reducing the commission fees, simplifying the procedures. So in this sense, I think digital transformation will bring certain benefits, and we have to think about this. Well, of course, we won't be able to close ourselves to the global market. So we should not avoid foreign instruments either. I'm talking about the white sector of the economy. So building this confidence and supporting the trend towards growth of serious retail investor, well, of course, the state should necessarily be present in this process so as to rule out any fraud, mis-selling, and to supply all the necessary guarantees, including just simple explanations, financial literacy, supporting this industry. So we do hope in this context that this trend will be supported, will be further facilitated, and the investors at large will also play their role in the development of the economy, in implementing the national projects which require from us concentration of all resources, not only of institutional investors, but also of retail investors, because they have quite high potential, as you've noted already. Thank you. Just wanted to give the floor to Alexey Savatugin, auditor of the audit chamber. Thank you, Alexey. I don't know whether I'm back from the ship to the bowl, maybe from the bowl to the ship. Actually, I've just arrived from the meeting where the President addressed the Federal Assembly. When I attended this meeting, I was asked documents only once. Well, in order to get through to the Gaidar forum, I had to go through different frames, 4 times. So that's why we're talking about financial barriers, because the barriers are quite serious on the financial market, and we haven't had, apart from microfinancial organizations, we haven't had new participants, new players on the financial markets, which is much worse, because if bad players could be substituted by new good ones, that means we could have had a good normal market. It's a kind of cleaning up the market, So we don't have any new entrants on the market. Well, but despite this, I see that there is this is a full room here. I don't know whether you've had a chance to listen to what the President has said. Well, I'm sure there will be a lot of discussions around that. He's offered a lot of many new solutions, but he mentioned, he talked about financial markets. Have you paid attention to that? That he mentioned? Has he mentioned anything about financial markets? He said nothing about financial markets. Well, of course, he paid tribute to the Bank of Russia for low inflation rate, for high gold and foreign currency reserves, for macroeconomic stability, and so on and so forth. And I quite agree with that. And the Bank of Russia has done really a lot towards a macroeconomic stability, working in such difficult conditions in recent years against many global and internal problems. But as for financial microeconomy, we do face certain problems in this. I think I have several minutes to carry on. Just recently, in December last year, the audit chamber summed up the results of some expert review events, analyzing two important documents: the key guidelines in the development of the financial market issued by the Bank of Russia for 2016 and 17, and the same document for 2019 and 2020. So we've actually could compare and could see the actual results summed up in these documents. So the full report of the audit chamber has not been published yet, but it's going to be posted on the website, and it will be open to everyone in January. So if anyone is interested, you can take a look at that. So let me just draw up some key results. Indeed, you can. I mean, it can be done by anyone without any problem, because all these data are in open access. On the whole, we in the audit chamber can note that the document titled "The Key Guideline, Key Areas of Development of the Financial Market" has been fulfilled, unlike in many other areas, in many strategic areas. It has been fulfilled 97.8%. These actually one of the leaders of the Bank of Russia, almost 98% out of 137 different events, different measures. I understand more than 130 has been actually executed. So, but the document. So everything is done in accordance with this document, but we are not happy about this. Has it led to the development of the financial market? No, it hasn't.
All the statutes are being adopted, some institutes were created, but what shall we see after analysis of the 5 past years, since 1916 till 2020, total volume of financial market of GDP dropped in 2016, not 15th, not 14th, that of clearly our worst years. In 16th, the macroeconomic stabilized from 110% to less than 103%. The number of the financial institutes, this is where I started, dropped according to some sector sources 2 times, especially microfinancial organizations. It's not drop of number of the financial institutes. There were 2,000 banks, now it's 400 banks. It's still competition. It's not one bank, not 2 banks. It's hundreds of banks, so there's competition. The same is true for the professional participants of the securities market, stock market players. What I'd like to note, the drop of the number of financial institutes is not only fall, its absence of the new ones, which is big minus, is the evidence of high barriers to the entrance, prohibitively high barriers to the entrance, and worsening of the financial system. Every revocation of the license of the participant of the stock market is not only minus to the investors that invested, or the clients that held money although there is a deposit insurance system, helps to recover the deposits. But for small businesses, decrease of the number of the demand for the service of external auditors, appraisers, rating agencies, information agencies. Every revocation of license means minus several trading terminals or information terminals. It's the wide-scale business, so it means there's cutting not only financial sector, but all adherent sectors. For several years, one rating agency is quite enough, we were told, because there's no demand. We made 2 rating agencies, so there is competition, so we're not blamed for not having competition. Last year we had another 2, so we have 4 agencies is too much, they said. Why do we need 4 rating agencies for 140 million people population? This is the quantitative indicators. As for the quality indicators, index of the global competitiveness that is being calculated and that we pay attention to. Place of Russia in the economy grew from 45th place to 43rd place. We are in the first 50 countries, and the tendency is positive. As to the segment that relates to the financial market and macroeconomics and the real sector, during those years, for 5 years, as we were number 95, we still stay like 95. We don't go below 100. As for stability of financial system, we at 120th place. As for the scale of financial market, at the 77th. As for market capitalization, we don't enter the first half 100. As for insurance premiums, first half premium. Moscow is rating financial centers as 71st. In terms of the number of indicators of financial markets, we're below 100s for such big country, for such huge economy, powerful economy, with good macroeconomics, with the surplus budget, with extraordinary reserves. If this is not right, it's not more decent. Such indicators of the financial market. As for GDP, number 6. But as for financial markets, number 100. Sorry. As for capitalization, yes. The last year was one of the record years in terms of the growth of the capitalization. We beat the world record of increase of the stock indexes, stock market indexes. All right, good. For investors, and praise the Lord, we have it. First of all, the quality of capitalization. How did it work this way? Arrival of retail investors for the last 2 years. We should pay tribute to the Bank of Russia and professional participants. Mass arrival of the stock investors, of retail investors into our market. We didn't dream to have it like this even 5 years ago, because the rates at the banking sector, we should look for more profitable investment, and out of the bank deposits, retail investors transfers investment to the stock market. Very high dividend income, one of the highest in the world. Companies pay big dividends, and the state stimulates the state companies to pay big dividends, oftentimes by administrative way. So 50% of the profits used for dividends. It's not on the federal budget, but of course all investors that have dividend income. Is it good or not? If they pay high dividends, doesn't it mean can it mean that owner doesn't believe in the future of the company, doesn't want to invest, doesn't invest? Can this growth last long if we give all profits in form of dividends? All right, this year was good. That year was good. What about long-term prospects? It's good if you don't invest. And the president always talks about investment into the charter capital, into the fixed assets. Our market of the corporate bonds is much more developed than the stock market. We don't remember any IPO, not good IPO, but any IPO. Number of the securities in the stock market listings. And Bank of Russia, his special position, he says we make priority in development of the share financing, stock financing, debt financing against share financing. That's not enough arguments for our regulator why bonds are better than stocks. At the same time, banking sector for the last year was growing through financiers. And in relation to GDP, we fixed not the most favorable conditions for crediting of the real sector of economy. They say don't have projects, we could give loans, but show me a good loan, show me a good project. When you talk to the real sector of economy, they have their own view, not just like that bankers have. What else we fix out of this public document named Key Directions of Development of the Financial Market? 13 KPIs were established. 8 of those were not achieved. Majority of KPIs subjectively based on surveys of the methods that Bank of Russia assesses itself, and it's very difficult to assess from this side. Formally, performance against document doesn't solve the problem set by the regulator before itself. 7 indicators were established for development of financial market. A quantitative indicator that can be checked, such as share in the sector. Just 1 was not achieved. Assets of the insurance companies to GDP. 1 was almost achieved. It's also in the insurance sector. 5 were not achieved. What is the evidence? There is a lot to do on the financial market. With all due respect, I'm sorry for coming late. I don't know what Mikhail Valeryevich spoke. He rather spoke about retail investors, about financial literacy, financial accessibility, fight against fraud, about pyramid. All of this is right, very proper and important. And any investor, any client of financial market, or clients of financial market support this. But is this enough to develop financial market? We, on several occasions, said there is a conflict of interest when regulator establishes the rules of the game and the largest player on this market and the largest owner on this market himself establishes the goals, himself performs against the goals, and also there is legislative restrictions. Today the president spoke about the change of the constitution. He didn't say that what I'm speaking about. Even the constitution, there is 75th article of the constitution about Bank of Russia. It speaks about independence of Bank of Russia and the key objectives to protect and provide security for ruble. And 114th article says about power of the government. It says that the government of Russia provides carry out the financial and the credit policy of the Russian Federation. How to combine these 2 articles the Bank of Russia was not about monetary article, and the statute on the Bank of Russia says that it conducts all the functions independently, and the is not removed the regulation of the market. There is regulation of financial market article where Bank of Russia is not mentioned, and statute on the strategic planning, what I'm telling you, the document of strategic planning of Bank of Russia is mentioned. It's the question to the legislators, not to the regulators. But these are also questions that, in my view, should be solved. Thank you. Thank you, Alexey. Just a word. Your colleagues started to become part of discussion that is being held with this agency. It's not the place for discussion. We invite you to talk. The discussion is very fruitful. Now, without going deep into details, even more so that we hope to receive report. Number of the working meetings took place, but direction of further progression is being dotted. Development of financial market to a great extent designed by the conjuncture, external and internal, and the combination, political, economical, social aspects. And of course, period of 14th, 16th, 17th years to a lesser extent were not too positive. When everything is falling and the markets don't grow, it is clear. But this factor should be taken into consideration. It should be properly interpreted. Its assessment of only finished cycle, but the key directions that are being initiated now. Alexey spoke about this, that in 2019 market grew. I think it will grow in 2020, although what we see in 2021, there's good chances. That's why conjuncture factor to minimum extent is dependent on regulator. Really in the 15th and 16th year concentrated, focused at more important at that point objectives such as inflation and macroeconomic stability. But most important, what I wanted to mention, that was made very professional, very good. I'm sure in his efficiency. Thank you. Yesterday was extended board of the accounting chamber, and the accounting chamber was named as a doctor, so I have dialogue with the doctor. Are you seeing a doctor? It's good not with the coroner. Valentin didn't keep himself in his hands. I'd like to give the floor to Alexey Beklemyshev, Deputy Dean of Economical Department of Moscow State University. Thank you, Alexey. I'll start off. We go into the high level of the matters, the government of the Russian government and the Central Bank of Russia. No, in the good sense. Mikhail, when he started, spoke about golden middle and the search for golden middle. We all are looking for golden middle. In our lives, it's not always possible. I'd like to go back in this context to the Russian economy, which is the brightest characteristic of the Russian economy. What makes it different? Disproportion. The Russian economics is disproportionate. 20 years ago, exactly, I was recalling at one of the wonderful meetings of the government of the Russian Federation, Vice-Man Jürgen of Knauf, chairman of board Knauf, he formulated dilemma of financial market, in my view, the most accurate, because Russian economy, money is not where it's needed, not where it's most efficient to use, because money, there is money in the Russian economy. Expert revenue plus amortization at the historical maximum. There is money. For some reason, this money doesn't come where it's supposed to come. Alec Vugan said two words. First, from the state. Second, financial market. What we did for the last 15 years, we tried to do it by the state. I don't know. What is your opinion? I'm deeply convinced that it didn't work out, that the state distribution didn't work, and it finished as full crash. And anyway, financial markets should play its role in overcoming this disproportion. By the way, disproportion is one of the interesting, for me, indicators. It's the source of investments of which we are so believe so painful. The investment in the charter capital is through the own funds. This happens in post-Soviet countries. We can recall Fukuyama, who explained why it happened so. The question is why. The external contour of money exchange was not organized. There's banking sector, but we can say that banking sector is another disproportion of the Russian economy, that 90% of the assets are concentrated in the banking sector, and we should do something about it. References that it's the heritage of the Soviet Union. The 5 to 6 banks that existed during the Soviet Union are slowly going to that direction. We had 6 of those for the Promstroybank, Zilsocbank, Sberbank, Neshtorbank. We move into that direction with long leaps. More financing supplied to the banking sector, and less stable is the structure. It's a well-known fact that many people used to talk about. Now about what can be and should be done to remediate this disproportion. It's the search for the golden middle, which is very difficult. We try to do it through the market, and later, as I said, we try to do it by the state. We need to have very delicate policy. It's targeting inflation. Drop everything, and we have 4%. We go this way or that way. This policy should be more delicate, and we hear the echo of finding golden middle. And I perhaps will offer few things that seem to me important from the standpoint of the state policy. I'll finish important fact about the national ID, the president's address. Let me talk about national ID. Now, start with the simple things. What do we do in financial market? The absurd insurance of deposits that made investment into deposits lossless game. So people have interest rate plus huge amounts they gain, and what is not falling into the subject are saved by the central bank. I'd like to talk about macro. They're important, but we made people think that playing with the credit institutions is lossless. And why should be surprised that the rest of the financial market occupies so little share?
The second subject, I don't like to criticize the Minister of Finance. I'm afraid of criticizing the Finance Ministry, but my academic career started in that particular agency. But I would like to say something about moratorium on pension resources. Why do you need this 39 billion provided there is a surplus? Also cannot understand the VAT increase, no reasonable justification for that. Talking about minor things, what about the non-market prices of certain stock? It's like unsalted fish or warm winter. So these bonds which are imposed on the market is something which is beyond my understanding. Well, the situation on the financial market is such as we describe it. And now about other things, the most painful things. I believe that I think somebody was mentioned the heirs, the people who received certain securities as a result of privatization, vouchers, that were inherited from grandparents. So which is impossible to do something about that for just a man from on the street. And the last thing is about a national idea. We've already gone through that particular thing, the massive capitalization increase in the market value of the Russian market and all Russian securities. So we've missed this once already. Right now we are at the minimum, at the bottom. So let's set it as a national idea, increasing the market value of our market and its fair distribution. I think that was mentioned by our colleagues from the very beginning. So the market value, the growth, should be distributed among as many people as possible, and probably in this case we will not have a reason to talk about poverty or increasing salaries for teachers. So let's think about this, and then we will be able to deal with all the problems. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next is Kirill Lukashek. You had a presentation? Yes, please. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Yep, just would like to put some pictures on the display, some slides. So would like to wish all of you a happy new year. Thanks a lot for an interesting comment by Alexey Lvovich, especially as regards the rankings agencies. I represent one of such organizations as a new player on the financial market, which is not typical in recent time. Regarding the prospects of infrastructural organizations, such as the rating agency. Alexey is aware of that. We arrange this kind of friendly polemics, debate, at least once a year. So, but in fact, the situation that we are facing today, the question of the quality, intelligence data, analytical data, I think that's a story which is quite useful to everyone. So what is good about the timing of the Gaidar Forum? First of all, because it's the beginning of the year, so it's not summing up the results, but the time for forecasting and looking ahead at least 1 or 2 years. So the ranking agencies are precisely involved in that particular business, a forecasting. So a sizable portion of credit ratings is also done thanks to that. So let me share the prospects of the 3 major segments of the financial market: the banking sector, leasing market, and the insurance market. And in closing, I will mention something that is related to our desires that will probably be quite instrumental in order to change the situation that is obtaining right now. So let's start with the largest system, the banking system. Unfortunately, I cannot go through the slides. What are the 2 key drivers in the banking sector? First of all, the consumer retail, which has not met demand, aggressively fought by the central bank, and mortgage loans, mortgages. Well, the dynamics is quite deplorable here, as you can see, in the retail, and of course the situation will change. On the one hand, the market is saturated, but on the other hand, it's quite serious regulatory impact. The rates of growth next year, this year, 2020, will be significantly lower, roughly 13% in retail credits. The mortgage loans will also slow down to a certain extent due to the saturation of the market and some economic factors. However, the quality of this asset is quite good on the banking market and in the bank portfolio. But here we can see the situation. On the one hand, the market mechanism pushes the mortgage rate down. It can be down to 8.5%, the average rate across the portfolio. On the other hand, which was quite an important revelation for me, the central bank has thought about the risks associated with that segment. As you know, there's been a report on possible overheating of the market in this particular area. So on the other hand, the analysts should, of course, support conservative measures in this area, but that's what I started to talk about. But that's the only quality and steady asset that continues to grow. That's what the central bank is fighting against, actually. So the default rate level, depending on the down payment and LTV, the leverage. So if we look at the whole situation on the historical portfolio, the default rate is about 2-point-something%. So in other words, thinking logically about this, instead of learning from banking scoring models, the business processes, which is a benefit because, in fact, in 2008 and 2009, when there was a certain downturn in quality, but the system of management in the banks, they could adapt their credit policies. So right now, what we see right now, which is a good quality of this asset, is in fact overdue amount is less than 1%. However, you know, the learning, self-learning of such products is quite important. So using a strict administrative levers, we can face certain consequences of such situation, which will be revealed later. So what is a real threat to the banking system? First of all, of course, is a low interest rate. First of all, paradoxical as it may seem, for the consumer it's a benefit, but for the financial system, of course, it's a serious threat. For the banking system, above all, because it has a serious impact on the percentage margin, on the interest margin. It will continue to go down in 2020, and the main threat here emanates from the fact that the nominal volumes do not go up. As we saw already, the corporate loans do not increase, retail is slowed down, which does not help the banks to generate their revenues. So despite some announcements and some loud announcements and statements, the input in the banking revenues has not changed. It was on the level of 15 to 17% all the time. So what we can say, we cannot say that it's a serious factor of investment revenue growth. So the key, so other factors are the key source of bank revenue, so bank margin. So if we look at the 5-year horizon, we can see that the key risk and the problem is, in fact, the slow pace of the economy. So we can see here the banking sector can demonstrate serious profit margin here. So my argument is that why are you so sound so alarming in this case, so dramatic. I say that the banking sector is demonstrating good margin. But of course, some revenue indicators is affected by provisions, allocations, and so on and so forth. So what the banking system saw last year, well, it was artificially shown that they had about 4 billion in profit. Well, of course, it's good when half of this profit is accounted for one credit organization, while others show a stable situation, but in many respects, it's just a technical indicator. The economic growth, 1 or 1.5%, this is our long-term forecast. This rate will not provide a growth in the corporate loan portfolio. Well, looking at this slow pace of the retail investment and the situation in the corporate segment, as we've heard already today, that the bankers have their own opinion on that, while corporate people have another opinion. So we see a decrease in the level of debt burden among many organizations. But from the point of development, it's quite alarming, because it means that under crediting by the banks, it may put a brake on the growth within the next 4 to 5 years. So this process, we are witnessing this process already. So every year we are losing the future added value as we lose in the corporate credits. But in fact, the quality of the Russian borrower, which accounts for about 80% of the credit portfolio, is quite good against the world standards. But in terms of the sovereign credit ratings, we've done, we did a research last year. We did this during 10 months, statistical data on more than 4,000 major Russian companies over the last decade. And what we saw that the default rate, which was calculated empirically with certain assumptions, is quite low. So basically, a major Russian corporate institution is quite stable. So we can talk about the state support and other factors and so on and so forth, but this is a fact. So for a good credit portfolio, we witnessing a stagnation in the loan portfolio. So I've already mentioned low margin, nothing will change here. The stagnation of population incomes, well, possibly some credit measures will help this, but today is not helping to increase the credit portfolio. And of course, the presence of a sizable share of state banks on the market. I think that's probably the size factor is of prime importance here, because in case of its downfall and the full-fledged default, the state may face a serious problem. So this is not in the context of ownership, in fact. So my wish is to ensure expert discussion in terms of the size of the banks rather than the structure of ownership. The leasing market. The island of stability and positive trends was quite interesting. It happens in the retail segment from the viewpoint of the growth of, first of all, automotive market leasing. We see quite a serious growth of this portfolio year in, year out, which continues despite the downturn in the car sales. The corporate segment is quite volatile, I should say, which because it accounts for 80% of the state companies. So purchases of cars or aircraft explain this volatility. So this trend will continue. We're not expecting any serious changes in that. So what I would like to say that it will depend heavily on the quality of reform on this market, because there are regulatory pressure may lead to lower appetites for risk. So the insurance market accounts for about 1.4 trillion rubles. So it is on the rise, which is not bad in terms of investor equity. Is one of the best markets in the context of the history of the financial sector. It's quite efficient business models in terms of expenditure historically, but if you look at different segments in the life insurance, we will see a channeling these resources from pay-as-you-go schemes to car insurance schemes. So we see this segment will continue to grow. The car insurance market, and so on and so forth. So proceeding from this, the key challenge is failure to achieve certain indicators in the insurance sector. So let me say that towards the end of the year, we are supposed to get to approach the 2 trillion figure. So that will be done by different agencies, including the audit chamber, including the strategy for the development of the financial market. So what are the risks that we see this year? So the key risk is the slow economic growth, weak private sector investment. So everybody discussing, and I mean the national projects, so everybody is discussing in what the amount that is going to be invested in that. We are discussing the first part of this issue, but not the second part of this question, where we should take these resources from and whether it's realistic. So this kind of debate is a kind of does not hit the target. So, and also our excessive expectations regarding the national projects. So the lack of desire on the part of the businesses to invest in this particular part will eventually lead to slow it down in the economy. How can the state help in this story? So first of all, improving the investment climate, that's will provide the biggest weight in this system. The second is important, expanding the logistics of project implementation, because we see that just a dozen of major companies are participating in this project. So perhaps we should think about expanding the access of small businesses towards implementation of state-run programs. That will create an added value in the gross domestic product. Easing budget policies, fiscal policies. The effect has been exhausted in this area, so we need to do something about this to support the fiscal story. Accelerating privatization, not only in the financial area, since the added value, the potential of the added value in the real sector, in the small and medium businesses as a supplier for big business. So far, the biggest share is still in the hands of the state.
I'd like to wish everyone to make this year better than the previous year. I'm ready to answer the questions. Thank you. I'd like to give floor to Boris Yarshevsky, Chief Vice President of Promsvязьbank, representative of the banking sector. What is your view on the problem? Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear participants of discussion, yet I don't have separate presentation, it's rather the expert commentary. I'd like to build probably my short expression around the practice of what we face every day while working with the legal entities and natural persons. PSB is universal bank. We have two segments. It's legal entities and military industrial complex, and we especially work with the segments. There's military personnel, members of the law enforcement, the people who defend the motherland. For us, coming close to the behavioral supervision, because always faced with those people and we interact. For our satisfaction in many ways is primary than the profit. It's quite strange because unhappy client with the weapon in hand that in best case goes to the deputy minister is bigger problem rather than any missed profit. Going back to the problematics that we see from private to general. We worked for the last year and a half with natural persons. We made selection of the survey, what we see in the categories of military personnel. Very high penetration of banking services from 2 plastic cards in 1 bank and more. More than half of the monthly salary goes for the compensation of different payments. First of all, MFO, based on our client base, every 6th client of our bank is participant of the MFO, and majority of the payments is there. More than the half of the revenue goes for the compensation of MFO, and to have quick money in some different place. And in such a way, we have some kind of the pyramid or the bubble. So the question will be how regulator sees this problem, whether there will be a movement such as how to make the situation healthier. What bank does? We increase financial literacy. There is very interesting observation, talking to people in the provinces, especially it's quite difficult to find qualified people in the provinces that sell products in the provinces. First of all, we have to teach specialists to the basic concept. Selling different products, you have to explain what's the difference between debit card from credit card, what is bank deposits. So the question is, in terms of financial literacy, how do you plan? What will you do? How can we, together with banking sector, do this? Next, in terms of the protection of investors, there's international practice. Maybe this topic was discussed earlier, analogous to Deposit Insurance Association organization that guarantees compensation in case of the revocation of license, compensation to natural persons. The different institutes such as CSS in UK, CIPC in the United States, who compensate the losses. FSE work with different segments of the market. This idea that because we say that very proper initiative and protection of investors, very timely idea in the financial market. Will there be a systemic solution that would allow to give guarantee to any participant of the market that some amount or some money will be reimbursed? And also the 4th topic, the central bank also develops preventive supervision. That's also practice quite good in my understanding. United States, there's a company that is called Land EDU and Bankrate. They organize a rating system between financial institutions when they gather information based on the complaints and commentaries and the build rating. This rating is being published. According to this rating, people make assumption. So it would be nice to have the same situation here. It would help to switch from paradigm of purely salary to satisfaction of the clients. This is all. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to give floor to my colleague, Yuri Danilov. Thank you very much. I'll go back to the systemic problems that were discussed at the beginning. Truly, the topic of financial system in the context of macroeconomic stability, very much of the merit of the Bank of Russia is the decrease of the interest rate, decrease of inflation, and under these conditions we observe quite strong flow of the funds from banking segment to the sector of financial institutions that work on formation of the long money and instruments of long money. That is definitely a positive point. I'd like to say that along with the financial stabilization that was mentioned, there is a second factor that enables such a transition, such as it's the tax factor. Implementation of tax benefits for the long-term holding of securities and implementation of the investment accounts is the second factor. In this case, is the merit of the central bank because of the monetary crediting policy, and the Ministry of Finance is quite obvious. And now, according to our estimate, potential of the funds that flow into long money that we call macroeconomical dividend, similar to the concept of demographic dividend that is used in many developing countries, very influential in terms of inflow of investments, an increase of the economic growth rate, macroeconomical dividends substantially bigger than demographic dividends in other countries. The potential is huge, but we're risking to, well, there are some forbidden words we can lose. Why? Because the central bank, the other wing of the central bank, starts to build the system of regulation of investors. The question is to protect investors or forbid investments by private investors. This is a very accurate question. It was stated that during discussion, it was said, Mikhail and Alexey said, they say they agreed upon. What do you agree upon? Upon what? To whose benefit? You agree to the benefit of financial organizations or to the benefit of the private investors? No one knows. Even more so in this dialogue of financial organization and the central bank, interests of private investors are not represented by anyone. Oleg made example. Too much time and money is to move investment from one account to another. When I had raw US stocks, quite a big package, but they were dropped. Deposit of the notary was higher than market value of the package that I was supposed to go to Amur province and pay deposit to the notary. The costs of private investors who invest into Russian securities are overwhelming, and I'm afraid that in this dialogue between financial organization and Bank of Russia, interests of private investors are not taken in consideration. Even more so if we orient at the documents and the draft law on categorization of investors that was done in October. Then I assessed this economical harm, understood that movement of this project into better direction. But it must be radical movement. Here, Mikhail said that in Europe, that they do it like in Europe. I'd like to say that Mikhail didn't mention certain points of protection of investors that exist in Europe, not only testing. Before testing private investor, you have to give him information. Is there much of information about the instruments that are offered to the private investors by the brokers? Does the issuer give a lot of information to the investor? There's another point. The term was not mentioned here. Compensation fund. Russia is the only country with more or less financial markets, doesn't have compensation fund, and central bank doesn't do anything about it. It's not interested in the fund, but this is instrument of protection of investors. It's not prohibition to invest, it's protection of investors. Then what Mikhail did mention, principally different borderline between simple security and complex security. If you believe it was stated, part of the shares are believed to be complex instruments. And Mikhail said that in Europe, derivative is complex instrument. In our case, according to this project, structured products, affordable, available to private investors, is the pile of derivatives, more complex for qualified investors. And elementary shares, part of them are not available. That's nonsense. Another very important point that was not mentioned, stimulation of long-term holding within the system of investors in Europe and the indicative adherence to the short-term speculations that took place, demonstrated by the central bank, with additional criteria of permitting private investors to come in or not come in. The volume of transactions, and overwhelming volume of transactions. Is it easier if a man invests for 10 years? Maybe it's good to look at the results of investment. Even if he made one transaction, I recall the conversation with Mr. Shuvalov, who invested in Gazprom. He said, for private investors, ideal instrument, the Gazprom shares, and I'm telling him, you have to select time when to invest. And Mr. Shuvalov agreed with this. Shuvalov was somewhat similar to Shuvalov. Maybe conducted one transaction and had huge profits. And the central bank is offering private investor to retail shares many times of Gazprom or anything. There's a big problem going into the politics. When I said a conversation of financial organizations and regulators, no one represents interests of private investor, people could object. Who would represent the interests? We don't have anyone who represents interests of private investors. If you take together with family members, those who invest into securities, who open accounts on the stock market, who have collective investment participation, more than 10% of Russian population. It's a huge initiative group of population. No parliamentary parties, no system opposition. Don't pay attention to it. There's no political and public force that would represent this big group of population. Here, many times was mentioning of the inclusion and stability. It was stated that they're quite interrelated. I'd say they have negative correlation. If you talk about inclusive of households, it's a negative correlation. And here, truly, very delicate point, finding optimum. But unlike of what was stated, we believe that at this point, central bank is pursuing a goal of maximization to show stability in favor of inclusion. In the best case, it's limitation. And the World Bank's position and scientific research says that optimum is achieved through two problems resolution, when inclusion is not limitation. It's also criteria. I believe that this is principal point that should be taken into consideration, and we should move to modern solutions. Question that was asked at the last point, I think it's very interesting, about behavioral supervision. I, honestly speaking, based on my experience, I learned that behavioral supervision of Bank of Russia works. If there is an infringement committed, the girls work. and the infringement is being remediated. There is no yet, what do we call, proactive behavioral supervision. What is proactive behavioral supervision? I'll use two small examples from my personal life. We have such an order that people living for abroad, they have to buy insurance policy, otherwise they will not get visa. And this is some kind of tax on the citizens of Russian Federation. And if you have insured event, try to get recovery. It's rather impossible. In this case, two categories, two variants. If, for instance, insurance company answers, if you treated the tooth, installation of crown, not me, but members of the family, insurance company said, we're not paying you because crown is not described in the terms and conditions of insurance contract. Although it says treatment of the tooth, understand, I write to the central bank, and central bank prevents this violation. Second point, plug of the tooth. The insurance company says, read the rules of insurance. This element, unfortunately, is absent. And we get, but the most important, I believe that within central bank, impossible to correct the situation, because Mikhail Valerievich decides to cut the bullshit, this fraud. More senior fellows who supervise the supervision, they'll actively object because most senior people are responsible for the supervision. They want to have adequacy of the capital of insurance companies. We're faced with the situation that in central bank the conflicts of interest accumulated is so much that no other regulating body in the world has this. The central bank should be divided. Then we'll have proactive behavioral supervision. Then we'll have efficient operation of on privatization of banks that central bank grabbed a lot. No time for. I used all my time, but still, as for the question, that was covered here, and it has to do with the previous statement. It's about influence of the financial structure of Russia onto the volatility of economic growth. Our research shows that the increased volatility of economical dynamics, the size of the banking system, otherwise, in other models, ratio of the assets and banking financial organizations, the increased volatility, share of export to GDP, in other models, export and import, and those who decrease the capacity of non-banking financial institutions. That's why this overflow, if you don't stop it, overflow of the funds of people from banks to non-banks will not only enable increase of volume of the long money, it will enable opportunity to protect the Russian economy from the external shocks.
In anticipation of would be a possible future crisis. Thank you very much. Well, it seemed like 2 hours is quite a long time, and we will have enough time to ask questions. But right now, I think we only have a chance to comment on certain presentations. I'm not going to provide a comment, but would like to say thanks to Yuri. Was really pleased to listen to what I told you about. It was with a certain pride that I listened to a brief gist of my presentation. But these are minor things. I'm not going to go into detail. Yuri, I do have high respect for you, but I'm not going to comment on the merits. But there are two realities, what I told you about and what you said about this. So please come to us and we will talk with you about preventive supervision, which you called proactive. But thanks to that, for the first time ever this year, complaints rate went down 4%, and about complicated financial instruments, not only derivatives, but any instruments in the structure which are quite difficult for understanding by retail investors, which I also mentioned. But I liked most of all about teeth. Would like to say that in Europe there are no dentists, there are stomatologists. You are a retail qualified specialist. If we follow this logic, let's sell to everyone. I think it would be much harder. We are against selling everything to everyone with blinded eyes. But I would like to invite you again. So let's discuss all these ideas. I just wanted to agree on that point that in our discussions with the regulator, there was no doubt that they would represent the interests of the investors, but we were fighting with the central bank for the right to represent the interests of investors. As he was saying that we are trying to protect the investors' interests, but we are talking about the choice of financial instruments by investors. So I think there's possibly a good reason indeed. Yuri, who sees a conflict of interests in different institutions, could reproach us for that. I mean, the conflict of interests is not. I don't think it's true, but I would really be happy to participate in such a discussion of investors, and I do hope that's part of this work. We've done a certain portion of this work. I was speaking also about what we have yet to agree on and about the certain agreements that have not been reached so far, but if you could give us some time, we will debate with the central bank on this, so we can talk about the third list of about foreign securities. So possibly we will reach a compromise, which will be much better than the one you were objecting to. Institutional investors. I subscribe to this idea. Maybe I was unable to disclose that in my presentation when I was talking about the investment funds and institutional investors. Due to the meager volume of this industry, they cannot provide the sizable impact on the stock market. There's about only 3 million of investment resources, less than 6% of shares on the market. Why do we need the state pension funds if they invest less than 30% of stock on the stock market? So they will never be able to occupy the proper place instead of other financial institutions, although the volumes are really significant. And they ignore this. This is related to a certain extent with regulation. And the central bank, by the way, has implemented its right to restrict due to certain social considerations in the industry. as they try to implement their role of the fighter for stability in this industry, in fact, acting as a long-term investor. And as for hopes that the active role of these institutions on the stock market, so let me say thanks to you for your patience and your attention, and of course pay due respect to our speakers. Thank you very much.